Hello, everyone. My name is Whitney Stoll. I'm your DC Post First Vice President. Alongside me is Bree Beal, our Programs Director, who is hosting this team's webinar and will be monitoring the chat today. So thank you all for joining us. We have many registered participants with us from all around the country for this program, so I know we can't wait to jump right into the presentation. It was my pleasure to welcome you all to our May First Friday luncheon session, which is being actually held on the second Friday this month for everyone who is traveling to JETC last week. So we wanted to have the opportunity to join us today. So please allow me to welcome Derek Kernus from DTS, who will be presenting the new requirements for protecting VA sensitive information. We'll learn more about the policies and solicitation clauses around this revamped information security requirement that just went into effect at the end of February this year. But I'd like to start welcoming you to our First Friday series, which is provided to you through SAME's commitment to offering AEC community effective training, development, and networking programs. The DC Post is helping sustain the future of the profession with these monthly education-focused sessions to deliver topical and relevant content to our industry. So thank you all for joining us here today as we start our program. But first, I'd like to go ahead and ask everyone to turn off your video and go ahead and mute yourself if you haven't already. And please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself to everyone, where you're calling in from, your organization. Feel free to share your LinkedIn profile. And go ahead and ask questions throughout the session, so we can address them at the Q&A portion at the end. Again, this is a lunchtime learning session for those who are joining us on the East Coast. So feel free to eat your lunch during this program. So we're so glad that you could join us here today, and happy to offer this virtual program to our community, regardless of where you're attending from. So let's start with a moment of silence to remember our active duty military, first responders, and all who need our care and thoughts throughout the world right now. Thank you. And next, could you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? So I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd like to take a moment to thank our DC Post sponsors for your continued support: AMT, Black & Veatch, Christopher Consultants, Consigli, Gannett Fleming, Spiniello, Stantec, WSP, Jacobs, Woods Peacock, AB Facility Service Solutions, Arche Consulting, Prime AE, and Stanley Consultants. We truly appreciate your support. We could not pull these events off without you, and we are grateful for your outstanding sponsorship. Your support helps us meet our society goals, including providing excellent content for our members, industry and government engagement, building resilient communities, connecting our future leaders through our student and young member groups, enriching the STEM pipeline, and preparing our military and veterans for life after service. If you're not already a DC Post sponsor and like to support our post with annual sponsorship, we'd love to add your name to the list for future programs and events this year. So please visit our website for more information about sponsorship levels and how you can give back to our community through sponsorship. Now it's time for our main program. So please note that this program provides one professional development hour from the DC Post. Look for an email with the subject line "Document Delivery" from SAME DC and Eventbrite with a copy of our program slides and your PDH certificate. We are recording this session and we'll put the video on our website later on. Now, I'm not going to read to you the learning objectives on the slide, since most of the objectives you saw when you registered. Instead, I want to introduce to you our presenter. So again, please feel free to introduce yourself, your organization, share contact information, and where you're calling in from. Throughout the presentation, feel free to address any comments throughout the Q&A, as Bree and I will be monitoring it the entire time. And we'll have time at the end of the presentation to ask questions, either from your chat, or we may ask you to turn off your video and ask questions directly to Derek. But for now, please mute yourself during the presentation. Now, to introduce Derek. So Derek Kernus is the Director of Cybersecurity Operations at DTS and leads a team of cybersecurity professionals focused on helping federal contractors and other businesses build or remediate their cybersecurity programs to meet compliance requirements. Derek was awarded the William and Mary Cipher Award for his leadership on change initiatives and served on the executive board for MBAA and the MBA Student Council. He earned his MBA from William and Mary School of Business and is a CISSP and certified cloud security professional from the ISC2. Derek, thank you for joining us today, and I want to turn the program over to you.
My pleasure, Whitney, and thank you all for having me. I'm looking forward to reviewing the new requirements for protecting VA sensitive information covered in a VAR update at the end of February of this year. So today we are going to cover the 7 updated parts of the VAR, and then we'll also cover VA Directive 6500, which is essentially the framework the VA uses for their cybersecurity controls that contractors with access to VA sensitive information are being directed to comply with. We'll discuss the risks of non-compliance and strategies for capitalizing on cybersecurity investments in general. One area that I really want to focus on today is how government contractors can utilize their cybersecurity posture for various requirements spread across the federal government, because we are seeing a lot of them come out. And it's a good business strategy to see how you can obviously make the most of those without spending too much money or covering controls you don't need to. And then we will wrap up with a Q&A session. So when I was looking at the VAR updates, I just want you all to know that this is pretty much what I look like. This is not going to be fun. For the most part, it was very confusing. And we're going to get through this together. But know that these updates jump all over the place. So I'm going to be trying to connect a lot of dots for you, because on the surface, I will say that these updates do not look like they would apply to members of SAME. For the most part. And once we start peeling back the onion and diving into some of the other references that are made within the regulation, we start to see that it actually probably does apply to many members of this organization. So you'll join me on the journey. So the 7 updates for the 7 parts, we have some updated definitions. Basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems, which is a term that you will see in many regulations across the federal government. So I understand that there are probably individuals and organizations in this webinar today that you have contracts with various government entities, not just VA. You'll see this term at DoD and CMMC. You'll see it with DHS. DHS is cybersecurity hygiene assessment just came out. They use the same term. It's used in many different areas. Then we'll quickly review describing agency needs, which actually has to do with liquidated damages and what that entails. Then acquisition of commercial products and services, and basically what's allowed to be purchased and what's not. Protection of privacy and freedom of information. That's going to have to do with sensitive personal information. Then the main, probably the meat and potatoes for a lot of you on this call today will be the acquisition of information technology. And this is the one that we will dive into a little bit more, where when we start to look at the different references that are in the regulation, we start to see how this probably applies to many contractors that work with VA. And then we'll cover a few sections in the final part, solicitation provisions and contract clauses. And I will say I am covering the areas that I thought were the most relevant to the audience today. There were very many updates in the VAR. A lot of terms, a lot of definition updates, a lot of information covered in there, especially so Part 802, 839, 852, there was a lot of information. I do suggest that you go look at it on your own. And when you see references to other documents, like especially in the FAR, you definitely want to go check those out as well to get the very specific information.
Hey, hey, Derek, sorry to intrude. Can you make sure you're sharing your screen?
Oh,
please?
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, now we're in business.
There's a beautiful picture of me that.
There we go. All right.
That's better. That's the agenda. And here are the parts. and Part 802. So this is the key term that I think everybody on the call wants to make sure they're reviewing, which is VA sensitive information and what that entails. So it's all VA data on any storage media or in any format. So that's going to mean either digital or electronic. Doesn't matter if it's stored on a physical PC, on a server, on a cloud server, or if it's in physical format, so on a piece of paper, that requires protection due to the risk of harm that could result from inadvertent or deliberate disclosure, alteration, or destruction of the information, and includes sensitive personal information. And that first part of the definition is critical because as we go through the regulation updates, I noticed that there are a lot of references to, there are different references to VA sensitive information and then VA sensitive personal information. And some of these updates that were made are very specific to that PII or PHI. And then there are other references very specific to just VA sensitive information. So as we go a little bit further into this definition, the term examples of VA sensitive information, kind of starting in the middle here, they include the following. And some of the areas that I thought are probably relevant to SAME members are going to be quality assurance information, critical infrastructure, architecture and engineering. That makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, at the end, there's that catch-all of any other information which, if released, could result in a violation of law or harm or unfairness to an individual or group, or could adversely affect the national interest or the conduct of federal programs. So a lot of times I urge contractors to look at these kind of vague, sometimes vague descriptions at the end where it's this catch-all if they're wondering whether or not the work that they do for their department or agency falls under any of these sensitive information requirements. And just my advice is use common sense. If you're designing a building, of course, critical infrastructure is going to fall under there. Sometimes there are questions about that I get from environmentalist organizations that are doing the environmental checks on an Army base, for example, where they're not sure if what they're doing could be included in this. And then I ask them about the type of information they get, and they receive information about the entire layout of the Army base, and it's hosted on their network. Well, that's going to be sensitive information from a DoD perspective, right? VA would be the same thing. If they were doing some sort of quality assurance analysis on the facility and they receive the plans from the facility, but they're not, not designing them, that would fall under this. So this is where we really see that sensitive information, really comparing it to another framework, this is just like CUI. In my opinion, VA using the term sensitive information, it's controlled unclassified information, which is actually a categorization of data across the entire federal government. We hear a lot about it today from DoD because of CMMC, but it's a government-wide categorization. It's used at DHS. It could be used here, but for some reason, VA chose to use the term sensitive information, but their examples that they give are all categorizations of CUI. So when we go into what VA requires specifically for the basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems, or CCIS, they have additional training requirements on top of technical requirements. So specifically referenced within the regulation are that the contractor and any contract, like employee contractors that are working on that contract, they must complete VA's annual security training. And it specifically has to be VAs. There was a commentary or a comment made when the rule was in public comment asking if the contractor could sub their training in. And VA specifically said, no, we need the contractor must complete our training. If accessing PHI, there's another VHA privacy and a HIPAA training that must be completed. Then reporting all incidents to the contracting officer and or the Corps within 1 hour of the incident being identified. complying with all VA's personnel security and suitability program requirements for the contractors that have access to VA information systems and data. And I'll show you later how VA does include that as the contractor information system as well. And then to comply with the specific activities directed by VA representatives when an incident occurs. So VA has the authority to direct the contractor to take certain actions, and the contractor must comply. Self-attest to meeting the contractual requirements on an annual basis. Again, that's one that we've seen in DoD. We're seeing it at DHS right now. They're the most recent one to come out with that type of requirement. And then maintaining the compliance record is another one, as well as flowing down these same requirements to all subcontracts and to the business associate agreements at any level. Now, one thing that's not referenced in here that is in the FAR and is required of every federal contract across the federal government is FAR 52.204-21. So while it is not directly referenced in this regulation, I say this in every presentation I do about compliance to make sure that every contractor is aware that these 15 information security controls are for protecting federal contract information. And I put 17 in here because there's actually one control. It's numbered 9 when you look at that FAR regulation. That it's actually 3 controls in one. And CMMC, if we talk about that real quick, CMMC level 1, it is that FAR regulation. They just broke it out into 17 controls, but it's literally the same thing. Point being, that is also part of basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems, and the VA has the authority to check that in addition to these other requirements listed above that are more specific about training and compliance maintenance. Those are 15 mostly technical controls that are expected to be in place as well. So be aware of that. So Part 811 covers describing agency needs. And this is one where they get very specific. These are for liquidated damages specifically involving breaches of VA sensitive personal information. So any PII or PHI that might be on a covered contractor information system is subject to these liquidated damages. And the purpose is to provide credit protection services to individuals affected by the breach. So of course, in their procurement, VA, they are transferring that risk to the contractor and providing some sort of compensation for that. And of course, if there's a breach, VA knows that they're going to be ultimately responsible for providing that protection service, the credit protection services we've seen multiple times over the past decade. And so they're going to transfer that requirement to the contractor that was actually breached as well. It goes on to say where this clause must be included in every what contracts it must be included in, which is every single contract where sensitive personal information is going to be created, received, maintained, transmitted by a contractor, subcontractor, or business associate, whether on a VA or non-VA system. So basically, they're covering all their bases and saying that if this breach is because or is caused by as a result of the actions of the contractor, whether it's on a VA system or not on a VA system, then that contractor is going to be held liable to these liquidated damages. With Part 812, we go into the acquisition of commercial products and services. And there's really two areas here where when purchasing things like medical equipment, or even if it's network equipment, when it's being purchased for the VA, any type of equipment, commercial product or service, there's going to be 2 different clauses. 852.212-71 is there can be no used or refurbished manufacturing supplies provided. And the one key thing here is that the vendor must be an OEM, an authorized dealer, distributor, or reseller. There's no gray market items to be provided. So the other clause would end in 72. They can use have used, refurbished, remanufactured items may be provided to support that solicitation, to fulfill the requirement of that solicitation. But if, again, the vendor must still be an OEM, an authorized dealer, distributor, or an authorized reseller. So gray market items in this context, further down in Part 812, VA defines gray market as any seller that is not officially authorized to sell that product, or if it's a reseller, distributor, authorized dealer that's not authorized to sell in that territory. So dealers, distributors, resellers should be very aware if selling their products to VA, and whether used or allowed to be used, refurbished, et cetera, or not, if they're authorized to sell in that territory. Because if they're not, they will not be considered for that procurement. And of course, counterfeit items may never be provided. And then specifically for contracts with access to Veteran Health Administration, PHI, under VA contracts, those organizations must enter into a business associate agreement to provide the same protections and safeguards as the covered entity, aka VHA. Prime contractors must flow down those requirements to subcontractors who are also involved in either creating, receiving, maintaining, transmitting VHA, PHI. And because this is VA sensitive personal information, liquidated damages do apply. So with this one, they're basically updating to say the contractor with access to this type of VA personal sensitive information must cover and protect that information in the same way that VHA does, which means that the contractor then needs to go back to look at how does VHA protect this information, and it's going to involve all the same protections with HIPAA, as well as some VA specific requirements. And then, of course, flowing it down and being aware that liquidated damages apply in the event of a breach. Now, here's where we get into the meat and potatoes of the updates with Part 839, the acquisition of information technology. So in there, it basically says, and this section is very wordy, it basically says that these requirements have to be included in all information technology acquisitions, including information technology related contracts, which may involve services or related resources. So when I first read this, the first thing that keyed me off that this may apply to professional services type companies is, of course, the word services. So when we dive further and we look into see what FAR 2.0 or FAR 2.1. FAR 2.101 will say, we look at that definition. What we're looking at for the definition is information technology. Information technology means any equipment or interconnected system or subsystem of equipment that is used in the automatic acquisition, storage, analysis, evaluation, manipulation, management, movement, control, display, switching, interchange, transmission, or reception of data or information by the agency. So they're covering all their bases here and essentially saying, if an agency is using information technology, system, subsystem, they're doing anything with data on that system, that's what information technology means. On the surface, that doesn't sound like it would apply to a contractor, but then it goes on to say, for the purposes of this definition, equipment is used by the agency if the equipment is used by the agency directly or is used by a contractor under a contract with the agency that requires its use, or to a significant extent, its use in the performance of a service or the furnishing of a product. So for services related, if a contractor is developing a drawing, if they are designing a system on their system, if they are providing products that are generated through that system, like it could be manufacturing, for example, they're manufacturing something very specific for the VA, then that would fall under this definition of information technology and would then be subject to the requirements in the Part 839 update. The term information technology goes on to say includes computers ancillary equipment, including imaging peripherals, input, output, storage devices necessary for security and surveillance, peripheral equipment designed to be controlled by the central processing unit of a computer, i.e. printers. So for architects out there, think your wide format printers. If the drawing is being printed and it's for the VA, then that printer is going to be considered part of that information system that's subject to VA sensitive information requirements. Software, firmware, similar procedures and services, including support services and related resources. So, and then it goes on to say what that does not include, and that would include, or it would not include things like information technology equipment that is acquired by the contractors incidental to a contract. So if a contractor purchases a different printer, just like a regular laser printer, and they don't print any sensitive information on that printer, and they have, the ideal thing would be to logically scope that out of the environment and prevent the ability to print to that from a covered contractor information system, that would not be included. And if we want to dive a little bit further into that, that would mean that we're creating enclaves or at a minimum, again, logical restrictions to prevent those pieces of equipment from accessing the sensitive information. Then the second part of this, it says that also information technology is not included that contains embedded information technology that is integral to a part of the project, but the principal function is not part of the acquisition, storage, analysis, et cetera, of the sensitive information. So things like the HVAC system within an office, if we're still working in an office and they've got a smart thermostat, that's not going to be included. That's one of the examples. Medical equipment where the information technology integral to its operation and things of that nature are not information technology. So we dive real deep into that FAR clause to determine the definition of information technology, which that FAR clause is directly referenced in the regulation. So VA means this is how we're defining information technology in this sense. So again, my interpretation, this directly applies to contractors. So the three big requirements, in my opinion, in this update are that the contractor is expected to be meeting VA Directive 6500 and the directives and handbooks in the VA 6500 series, including but not limited to VA Handbook 6500.6. We're going to dive into VA 6500 in a minute, but I'll say very quickly that VA Directive 6500 is like NIST 800-171, for those of you that have heard of that. That is the framework from NIST that is derived from the federal government's security control requirements. That's a document called 853. NIST created one that's specifically for federal contractors that consists currently of 110 controls called NIST 800-171. It's in revision 2. Revision 3 just came out for draft actually a couple days ago. That's what's recommended for all departments and agencies to use to protect sensitive information or controlled unclassified information. VA went a different route. And in my opinion, it actually makes it very confusing for contractors that may not be familiar with all of these frameworks that I'm referencing right now. The next one is that the requirements apply to all VA contracts and services with access to VA information, VA sensitive information, and then they break it out here as VA sensitive personal information that is created, received, maintained, or transmitted, or will be, and that is a big one where it's will be, and they've also used the term may in here. I forgot to mention that earlier. They're very specific on that language. If it's possible that it could happen, the contractor is expected to be compliant with these requirements. And if it's going to be created, received, maintained, or transmitted by VA, a VA contractor, subcontractor, business associate, regardless of the format, and whether it resides on a VA system, non-VA system, contractor system, subcontractor system, third party, or cloud system, must be compliant with those requirements. So that cloud system one and the third party system one is, again, interesting to me because it's referencing, hey, if you offboard any of these responsibilities, if you outsource this to a cloud vendor, The contractor has to also make sure that that cloud vendor is also meeting these exact same requirements, which again, that gets very hairy. Because typically, unless we're using FedRAMP systems where it's already well documented, it can be very difficult to get some of this information from cloud vendors. Not all the time, but it's a lot easier when a contractor is using a FedRAMP certified system. Then the next one is that the contractor shall apply appropriate NIST standards to maintain the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information system. So in the cybersecurity world, that's the CIA triad. Those are the three core areas that all cybersecurity professionals are focused on maintaining. Maintain that confidentiality, access to that sensitive information, maintain the integrity, make sure that the data is exactly as we think that it is, so that if there is a breach, this is one example, if there is a breach, that integrity of that data, it hasn't been modified, and if it has, can we tell? Then the availability, especially in a cloud-based solution or a scenario with a cloud-based system, how often it is available. You know, typically in the cloud security profession, we're calling that the 4 or 5 nines. So ideally, we want to have cloud providers that have a 99.99% uptime. A 99.999% uptime is the best. I think the statistic is that the downtime for that total is 26 minutes a year. So that's something that we should be looking for in procuring cloud services. But also, if a system is completely hosted on premises, we need to make sure we're protecting that availability and that we're doing it against the appropriate NIST standards. So I see that I've got maybe 10 minutes left. So I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly, because once I started diving into this area, this is where I got like this again, because this is where it gets real wild. Connecting all the dots and mapping everything can get a little exhausting. So VA Directive 6500, it'll tell you right up front, it's based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. So this framework currently has 6 functional areas, and it has categories and subcategories. And then those subcategories, they're mapped to different frameworks that the contractor or the organization, because this is used by state agencies, by local entities, and it's used by private organizations. So it has a couple of frameworks that can be used to help meet the cybersecurity framework. So it's generic, I'll say, in a sense. So they do a great job. NIST has done a great job of saying, hey, here's a great framework to use, and you can use 5 or 6 different frameworks that are more specific to help you meet the overall tenets of our categories and subcategories. 6500 is not a direct one-to-one. So the subcategories, if you all get a chance to look at 6500, those are what I would call the cybersecurity controls of the NIST cybersecurity framework. They're not extremely specific, which is why the next step is the reference guide that you'll see in CSF that references the other specific frameworks and the specific control families in there. But it's not a direct one-to-one, and especially because when you go through and you look at 6500, in the first couple of controls that are listed, there are extra requirements in there that are not directly mapped to CSF. So that first thing that tells me is that VA has tailored this to their specific requirements. So I'll use a very quick example. And by the way, this is written for VA, which is also what makes this very difficult, in that a contractor, if they're supposed to be compliant with it, when reading that document, they're also going to have to interpret how they can meet the same requirement, because this document wasn't written for a contractor, it was written for the VA. So the first 2 requirements in there, the first one essentially says that the VA has to inventory all of its hardware, software, applications, etc. That is a subcategory within the NIST cybersecurity framework. The next control right directly beneath that is that inventory must be housed in a specific VA system. That contractors are not going to have access to that VA system to put their inventory. And as a contractor myself, I wouldn't want to put my inventory that I own into the VA system. That's mine for my management. So the contractor then has to make a decision. So to meet that next requirement where the VA says, okay, the VA has to put it in this specific system. Well, where am I going to store my inventory? Am I going to do it in a Dropbox site? Am I going to do it in SharePoint? Am I going to buy a special tool like Aptega or FutureFeed or Totem where I can manage my inventory in a cloud-based solution? How do I want to do that? So we go down, and the other thing that's pretty interesting to me is that there are 158 total controls within, and they're not numbered, by the way. I had to go through and count each one of them, and then I had people on my team count as well to make sure that I got the same number, or that we all got the same number. But there are 158 total controls, and that's significantly more than NIST 800-171, which currently has 110. What I noticed as I went through those is that all of those controls may not apply to the contractor. And what that meant to me is that the contractor could and should, in my opinion, take an approach like getting compliant with ISO 27001. Another framework very commonly used. You may have seen it in government procurements. It's been used for quite a long time. Helps get points on some scoring methodologies. But within that framework, there are, with the 2022 version, there are 93 controls in the appendix. And not all of those controls will apply to every contractor depending on how they have their system designed that they're getting certified. So what they can do is they can write in their SSP, their Information System Security Plan, that control is not applicable and a justification. And that is sufficient for an auditor as long as the justification is valid and forgive my language, but the auditor buys it, right? There's good evidence to show that does not meet, or that is not applicable to the organization. In my opinion, there are controls in this framework where the same thing could apply. So the organization is going to have to use their best judgment on which ones they need to be compliant with, but also, again, document why there are other controls that they feel do not apply. Another thing that's kind of a ding here with 6500 is there's no assessor's guide like the NIST framework. So for the frameworks that I've mentioned already where there are controls that the organization has to meet, so NIST 853, NIST 800-171, there's a supplementary document, or I should maybe call a sister document, that's called 853A, 871A. That's the assessor's guide. It tells us the assessment objectives, the things that the assessor will be looking for to demonstrate compliance with that control. So for an example, with NIST 800-171A, for the first control in that framework, there are 6 assessment objectives. The organization has to meet every single one of those assessment objectives to demonstrate compliance with that one control. There's nothing like that, at least not that I found, for VA Directive 6500. So it is very generic in the sense that it's telling the contractor what to do. And of course, the government's never going to tell us exactly how to do something, but they have generally given more guidance than what I've seen here from the VA. Now, that's not to say that the contractor can't take steps to help themselves to make sense of it and justify how they've implemented one of these controls. So my suggestion here is to map the controls from the relevant NIST cybersecurity framework subcategories, which would require looking at 6500, looking at that identified category right up front, and then mapping to the category and the subcategory and looking at the control and saying, okay, now on the very far right of the matrix in the NIST CSF, I've been told before that I have to apply appropriate NIST standards. So it's telling us here that we need to use NIST from the CSF. So it has references to NIST 853 for the controls for the subcategories. So the best thing to do, and so here's the example, is the control, what I would call the control number in the Directive 6500 it's in Part 2, and then it's in paragraph A, 1A. That very first control in 6500 maps to subcategory ID.AM-1. And in that framework, it then maps that to NIST 853 revision 4. To really fully demonstrate compliance with that, to really make sure it's polished and have no questions, map it to NIST 853A and look at the assessment objectives for change management and I think PM's program management. And those specific controls, meeting those two controls would suggest that the organization is overall meeting this control in 6500. Now, I will point out that NIST 853 revision 4 is the old version. It has been superseded by NIST 853 Rev 5. The cybersecurity framework is currently in version 1.1. Version 2.0 is out for comment. That one maps to Rev 5. But because it's not finalized, my recommendation here is to continue to map to Rev 4. There weren't a lot of changes in Rev 5. There were changes, but most of the control numbers stayed the same. They actually added more controls. But because that's the most current version of the cybersecurity framework, which is directly referenced in here, that's what I recommend. I will note, though, that in the comments, if you read the everything in the Federal Register, in the comments that were made, a response from VA was to actually look at 853 Rev 5. So to me, it's a little conflicting because they're using cybersecurity framework. I'm not going to use the new cybersecurity framework because it's still in draft. I'm going to use what's current and finalized, even if it maps to an old revision. So that's my recommendation. A lot to digest on that one. So then we go into the text and provisions of the clauses, which provides additional guidance on, and there's a ton of information here. Again, why I strongly recommend going to Federal Register and reading the full ruling. But these are some of the key ones. In accordance with with the data destruction plan in 6500, it has to be met within 30 days of termination or the end of the contract. The destruction requirements are actually listed in 6500, but it's also referenced a couple times in the regulation or in the final ruling. And it's basically NIST 888 is using those that guidance from NIST to destroy data. It has to be done within 30 days. The other thing that's a bit of a bear is that it specifically says that if the contractor must use, if they're storing, transporting, or transmitting. So basically, think of it, most simple example would be storing data on your local PC, or if you're sending an email to somebody with VA sensitive information, or putting it into a portal, a web portal. If it's one that's maintained by the contractor, they have to be using FIPS 140-3 validated cryptography. That one was very surprising to me because 140-2 was the standard for a long time. They finalized 140-3 last year for use, but they sunset 142. So 142 is still allowed to be used across many parts of the federal government. Not all cryptographic modules, I think it fully sunsets in 2025. So not all cryptographic modules are going to be 140-2. It actually, the language in there actually says I think it's 140-3 or algorithms that superseded, something like that. So basically it says the minimum you can do is 140-3. That can be a real big challenge and can be difficult, especially when you're working with cloud vendors. So make sure you're checking your documentation thoroughly when going through those procurements. If you're using cloud services, make sure that their algorithms are 140-3 validated, meaning it has a certificate from the NIST cryptographic module program. I cannot remember the name of that one, but it has to have a actual certificate. It can't just be FIPS compliant. That is not acceptable. Another big change was reporting the activity, the suspected security or privacy incident to the contracting officer and the Corps within 1 hour of the discovery of the incident. And then the contracting officer can determine the maximum number of days to remediate that incident in the contract, but it cannot be longer than 60 days. So if there's an incident, it has to be closed out, and that gap has to be remediated within 60 days. Also, the information system security plan, so the document that outlines everything that we're doing to meet these requirements, which again, in my opinion, at the end of the day, it should be written to 853A at a minimum, should be submitted to the contracting officer within 90 days of the contract award for the contracting officer to review and approve. And then it goes on to say that the ISSP or information system security plan must include but not be limited to those requirements. So again, the NIST guidelines, I take that to mean CSF going back to 853. And the other things would be like NIST 888 for media sanitization, things like that are referenced. VA Directive 6500, the handbooks in the VA 6500 series, and then Personnel Security and Suitability Program from the VA Handbook 0710. So risk of noncompliance could be considered a material breach of contract. That's pretty straightforward. We've covered the liquidated damages under Part 811. Then that, again, very specific to VA sensitive personal information is how that's referenced. The big one, it's not directly discussed within that regulation update, but it's a prosecution through DOJ's Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative utilizing the False Claims Act. So while DOD, because they're doing something very different than every other department right now, where they're implementing a third-party verification to demonstrate compliance with their requirements, other organizations are still other departments are still allowing their contractors to self-attest, but with I believe they're feeling more comfortable with that because of DOJ's use of the False Claims Act in their Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative that was announced in 2021. So they're still allowing contractors to self-attest to this requirement, but this provides more of a risk for falsely self-attesting. Whistleblowers are incentivized to report false attestations. They get up to anywhere between 15 to 30% of the money that's recovered by Department of Justice. The government can recover 3 times its losses plus a civil penalty. One thing I forgot to add on here is that the senior official that self-attested to meeting these requirements can be held personally liable as well. The first 2 settlements, they happened quickly with this, even though it's been in place for about 18 months. There have been 2 settlements so far. I believe there are other litigations that are probably happening right now. Litigation could take a long time. But the first 2 settlements together, the very first one was $930,000. The second one was $9 million settlement plus additional, I forget what kind of fees, but there were additional fees tacked onto that. And that was both of those were from a whistleblower. So there are some serious risks of not complying with these. And in most instances, what happens, you either have a whistleblower or what we see is that the organization has a breach that they cannot cover up and they have to report it. And then there's an investigation done and they're found to not be compliant. And then that starts the ball rolling as well. So capitalizing on these investments, one thing to keep in mind is that the contractor is also protecting their information here. Cybersecurity risk is a very real threat, even now more so than ever. I'll say one thing that I've noticed in the space is that when Russia invaded Poland, cybersecurity attacks escalated dramatically. I think I saw a statistic that phishing emails went up like 300% within the 1 month after that. And that's a whole nother conversation about why that is. But small businesses are a real target for this. They are a test bed for viruses and ransomware and malware because bad actors are not expecting them to be monitored, basically. Not only not have cybersecurity controls in place, but monitored so they can sit there and test out everything because they're not being tracked. The organization has no idea. So for that reason, I'll talk about this very briefly in a moment. For that reason, that's why this is not 100% an allowable cost, but cybersecurity costs are allowable on contracts. Another thing is cross-reference the frameworks that your organization is required to be compliant with other frameworks. So I put the 3 on here that, I'm very aware of that are finalized right now. VA, DHS, DoD. VA, the requirements are similar, but they're a little more, they're more different than DHS and DoD. DHS and DoDs are a 1-to-1. So what's great for a contractor that's meeting DoD requirements with CMMC is they're inherently meeting all DHS all requirements already, because DHS doesn't require everything from NIST 800-171. DoD does. So it makes working with DHS, because they're already compliant with DoD's requirements and CMMC level 2, essentially, DHS is great. VA helps hit a lot of those, not all of them, but look at other opportunities if you're working on the VA Directive 6500, and again, thinking those controls that apply to your organization. Go back and look and see which ones apply to other frameworks at other departments that either you're currently working in or that maybe are targets for you, and try to capitalize on that. And that could also help you if you're in a position here where you're trying to justify it to your leadership on making these investments. That is a very good business justification to go in with, and maybe even might be able to put a little ROI behind. Also, when your company meets these requirements, especially if you get it third-party verified, that's going to provide more weight. So, ISO 27001, if you have HIPAA compliance requirements, you can get that certified. If when CMMC, if and ever it gets finalized level 2, that carries a lot of weight in an RFI and can help the government feel more confident that the contractor is actually meeting the requirements versus a contractor saying that they're doing it within the contract or within the RFI response itself. So, not saying that you shouldn't highlight it if you haven't had a third-party attestation yet. There's still going to be value in that, and be prepared to demonstrate that if and when you get to the RFP process. But that can really help shape an opportunity, because again, what we know is the government is very focused on cybersecurity procurement requirements right now. And then remember that cybersecurity costs are allowable. And I'll just kind of plug something else very quickly. DTS, we are hosting our own webinar on June 8th at 11 a.m. Where we are going to be talking specifically about this with an accountant that also happens to be a cybersecurity professional. I've met him and talked with him over the past 5 months and still have not gotten around to asking that question somehow, how that happened. I'm probably going to bring that up in our fireside chat. But Michael Tomaselli from Chess Consulting is going to be discussing with us exactly the strategies that contractors can use to include these in their rates and help us remain competitive. And that is a key thing to keep in mind too, is that, with self-attesting, there certainly is a risk there, because if a contractor is attesting but not actually meeting the requirements, and this was a problem that DoD had, they're not going to include that in their overhead rates, and they're going to look more competitive from a price standpoint. So one of the things I'm going to talk to them about is, what does that look like for protests moving forward? Thank you all for your time today. Did not do a good job of keeping it short. We've got 5 minutes, but I am available to stay after 1 o'clock for any additional questions that anyone would like to ask. Thank you for your time today, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Hey, Derek, thank you very much. We have time for maybe a few questions. We do have some in the chat. So that was definitely very, very informative. And I think people definitely appreciate it. So why don't we dive right into questions here. We do have one from Dave Federoff from USACE Norfolk. It's a multi-level question. So if I need to repeat it, let me know. So is there a single federal requirement for a firm to comply with? He says, listening how they have to comply with specific VA requirements, say annual training or suitability determinations, I would imagine that DoD would have something specific to them as DHS as well. Does a firm now have to comply with each of these agencies specifically, or just a single standard? I was just trying to understand the challenge the AEC industry will face is supporting multiple federal agencies. From
that is a good question about training. So I'll start with the national cybersecurity strategy has been released 3 times, and it was very recently released. And one of the initiatives in there was to standardize cybersecurity requirements. But interestingly, it was internationally, not within the United States, which I think was a huge gap in that strategy, because there's so many departments within the federal government that have their own requirements that make it difficult for contractors and organizations that want to work with the federal government to meet all of them. So unfortunately, to answer your question, I know with DoD that DoD has specific training that is required when working on a DoD contract that must be completed at least annually. VA has the exact same requirement, that specific training to VA must be required. And that was a question that was submitted during the public comment period for the update to the VAR. And VA actually asked that exact same question. Can we use our own training that we have to meet this requirement? VA said, no, you have to use our training. So the contractor needs to look at every department and what their specific requirement is. What I will say, though, is with DoD and DHS, with them being aligned with NIST 871 controls, there's a control in there that requires ongoing training. DoD's training that they require an organization to take annually can meet that requirement for both organizations. DHS, as far as they have not asked or said anything about specific training to them. So, you can use that DoD training to meet the annual requirement for the contractor covered information system.
All right, great. I think we have time for one more. How do I know if the data being accessed or generated in performance of my VA contract falls into the VA sensitive information category beyond the definition in Part 802?
That is a toughie. So one thing that I did not get a chance to look into is what VA's labeling requirements are, because they use the term sensitive information and not CUI. I'm not 100% sure if they have the same labeling requirements that NARA has for different categories of CUI. NARA is the overarching authority for controlled unclassified information. So the first thing I would look for is just go to the contract office and say, hey, if I get VA sensitive information, is it going to be labeled first and foremost? And then ask them directly, am I receiving sensitive information, or am I generating sensitive information in my performance of this contract? Put the onus back on the government, have them clarify it for you. But also be aware that we have seen with some departments that it is ultimately the contractor's responsibility to determine what they are creating. If it is sensitive information, they are not allowed to label it, but they must know whether it's controlled unclassified information, sensitive information. If it is and it's not labeled, then they have to contact their contracting officer or the Corps and say, hey, we have this piece of information. We think that this is sensitive. Can you please look at it and label it appropriately? It's a lot of extra steps, but fortunately, it's the way it's got to be done.
Great, got it. Why don't we wrap up? We're happy to stay a couple extra minutes if there's if anybody has any additional questions. But thank you, Derek, for the insight into this, and thank you everyone for participating in today's session. We really appreciated your time with us here today. It's definitely a very informative presentation with definitely some great takeaways. We have a lot of interest from our participants here today. So again, thank you all. Before we wrap up our presentation program here today, I'd like to share with you some of the upcoming events that we have planned. So please mark your calendar for some of our upcoming local post events, as well as some of our upcoming national events that we have here today, with our first Friday coming up next month with Jill Berdeen on the DD Form 1391, which is Friday, June 2nd, that we have coming up. And then then we have the NIH Project Campus Tour coming up on June 7th. And then we have our joint conference with CMMA at the Army Navy Club on June 20th. Downtown. And then we have the Small Business Conference on November 1 through 3rd. And the call for presentations is on June 12th. If you'd like to actually submit an abstract, it says due on June 12th. And then we do have, so SAME National is putting together a OBO Industry Day at the Grand Hyatt in DC on the 29th to the 30th of June here. And then the other upcoming events we have on July 7th, we are looking at ChatGPT and large language models for proposals. And then on October 4th, we have the golf tournament over at Andrews. So the full list of lineup is available on our website. So the national website is currently being refreshed, so please look for our events at the DC Post page. Please add Classic to our web page to get the full calendar of events. So that is, I think that's, thank you all again for attending our first Friday luncheon session. And thank you, Derek Kernus at DTS, for providing excellent content today. I would like to thank, one last time, thank our DC Post sponsors again for supporting us. Look out for document delivery on the slides and a PDH certificate today. And a recording of this event will be available on our website later this month. Have a great weekend, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at our next program soon. Take care. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.